The Messerschmitt's engine screamed as Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann pushed the throttle forward, climbing through 7,000 meters over the German heartland. Through the armored glass, he could see them, a formation of American bombers, their contrails etching white lines across the October sky of 1943. He'd shot down 4 heavy bombers in the past 6 months. He'd faced British Lancasters and Halifaxes at night, watched them burn and tumble. He'd intercepted American B-24 seconds and sent them spiraling earthward. Today would be no different, he thought. Today would be 5. His wingman, Lieutenant Klaus Becker, held position off his right wing. Through the radio, Werner could hear the other pilots from their Gruppe checking in, their voices professional and calm. They were veterans, most of them. They knew their business. The intelligence officer had briefed them that morning on the target formation, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. The Americans called them the newest G, a model variant, heading toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The officer had been precise about the defences. 13 machine guns per aircraft, 13 Browning M2 50 caliber weapons, he'd said, pointing to the silhouette drawings. Nose, tail, belly, top, sides. Werner had memorized the positions during the briefing, calculating angles of approach, dead zones where the guns couldn't track. 13 guns on 1 bomber. It was heavy armament, certainly. The British bombers carried fewer, but Werner had faced concentrated fire before. You didn't survive 53 combat missions by being careless, but you also didn't survive by being afraid. 1 aircraft, 13 guns. You picked your angle, you came in fast, you fired, you broke away. Mathematics and nerve. Every fighter pilot knew this. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But as Werner's Messerschmitt climbed higher, something began to change in his perception. The bomber formation wasn't small. It wasn't 6 aircraft or 8. As his altitude increased and his perspective widened, he began counting. 3 elements of 6 bombers each, another 3 elements behind them, then another grouping beyond that, stacked in altitude. 18 bombers in the first combat box, another 18 in the second, a third box beyond that. His hand tightened on the control stick. He'd been told there would be a large formation, but seeing it was different. The briefing room map, with its neat little symbols, hadn't captured this. The bombers weren't scattered targets. They flew in a precise geometric pattern, each aircraft positioned in 3-dimensional space relative to the others. Not a loose gaggle, but a structured formation with overlapping layers. Werner's mind, trained in tactics and mathematics since his cadet days, began performing calculations he didn't want to complete. The Americans had been bombing Germany since January of that year, 1943. At first, the raids had been smaller, testing. The 8th Air Force was learning. So was the Luftwaffe. Werner remembered the early interceptions, when American bomber formations had been loose, when individual aircraft could be separated and picked off. Those days, he realized with a cold clarity, were over. What he saw ahead wasn't a collection of individual aircraft. It was something else entirely. A system. A machine made of machines. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio. "Hoffmann, do you see the size of this? How many boxes are there?" "3 that I can count," Werner replied, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe more beyond." The formation was still 5 kilometers distant, but already Werner could see the dark shapes against the white vapor trails. The Americans flew high, above 8,000 meters, where the air was thin and cold. They relied on their Norden bomb sites and their tight formations. Intelligence said they believed they could bomb in daylight without fighter escort, that their defensive firepower would be sufficient. Until today, Werner had thought that belief was foolish optimism, American arrogance. Now, approaching the formation with the sun behind him, the classic advantage position, he wasn't certain. The radio came alive with the Gruppenkommandeur's voice, calling out attack positions. Werner's swarm would take the lead bomber in the forward element. Standard doctrine. Approach from the rear quarter, where your closure rate gave the tail gunner minimal tracking time. Fire at 300 meters. Rake from engine to cockpit. Brake below. Repeat if necessary. Werner had done this twice before successfully. One British Lancaster, one American B-24. Both had gone down, but those had been night missions, single bombers caught alone, or small formations, 3 or 4 aircraft, where the defensive fire was manageable. This was different. Werner pushed the thought away. He was Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, veteran of the Eastern Front, holder of the Iron Cross First Class. He'd flown against Soviet fighters over Stalingrad when he was 20 years old, had learned his trade in the murderous skies over the Volga. He was 23 now, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He would do his duty. The Messerschmitts formed into attack position, throttling back slightly to match the bomber's speed of approach. Werner could see the lead box clearly now, 18 B-17 seconds arranged in a pattern he'd never seen before. Not a simple V formation like bombers typically flew. This was a staggered box, aircraft arranged at different altitudes and lateral positions, creating what looked like a 3-dimensional crosshatch. As he studied it, understanding began to dawn. Every position in that formation had been calculated. Each bomber's guns could cover the approach angles to the bombers beside it, above it, below it. There were no dead zones, or if there were, they were minimal, theoretical gaps that would exist for only seconds as a fighter screamed through. The formation wasn't designed to protect individual aircraft. It was designed so the collective defended everything. Werner's throat felt dry. The intelligence officer's briefing echoed in his memory. 13 guns per aircraft. He'd divided his attention between that number and the recognition silhouettes, memorizing where each gun position was located. But he hadn't multiplied. 13 guns per aircraft. 18 aircraft in the box ahead, 234 guns, 234 barrels of 50 caliber ammunition, all potentially firing at him. His hand, so steady moments before, trembled slightly on the throttle. He tightened his grip, forced himself to breathe. Combat was always dangerous. You couldn't think about the danger, or you'd freeze. You flew, you fought, you relied on training and instinct. He'd faced anti-aircraft fire before, the black bursts of flak that could shred an aircraft in seconds. This was just machine guns. Smaller, faster targets could evade, but there were so many of them. The Gruppenkommandeur's voice cut through the radio chatter, sharp and commanding. All aircraft, prepare to engage. Attack in pairs. Hoffmann, you're cleared for your run. Werner acknowledged, his voice automatic, professional. Beside him, Klaus held formation, waiting for Werner's lead. The 2 Messerschmitts accelerated, diving slightly to build speed. Werner's tactical mind took over, suppressing the growing unease. Speed was life. Come in fast, fire, break away before they could track you properly. The closure rate would be over 700 kilometers per hour. No gunner could track that smoothly. Simple physics. Except there were so many gunners. The sun was behind him, perfect attacking position. The lead B-17 inches, the formation grew larger through his gun sight. Werner could see details now, the oval windows, along the fuselage, the ball turret beneath, the tail position with its distinctive vertical stabilizers. Behind it, other bombers held their positions with mechanical precision. Not a single aircraft had broken formation, despite knowing German fighters were approaching. Their discipline was remarkable and unnerving. 3 kilometers distant, Werner armed his weapons. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 carried 2 13mm machine guns in the cowling and a single 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. He'd upgraded to the Rustsatz VI package months ago, adding 2 20mm cannons in underwing gondolas, 4 cannons total, against 13 machine guns per bomber. Except it wasn't one bomber, it was 18, it was 234 guns. Stop counting, he told himself. Stop thinking. Just fly. 2 kilometers. He could see the formation clearly now, could see the individual aircraft maintaining their precise spacing. The Americans didn't waver. They didn't break. They held position as if they were on parade, as if death wasn't screaming toward them at 600 kilometers per hour. Werner's finger rested on the trigger. He was committed now, diving toward the tail of the lead aircraft, coming in from the rear quarter just like doctrine taught. The range closed. 1,500 meters, 1,200. His gun sight centered on the bomber's fuselage, tracking the target as the massive aircraft seemed to float in his sights despite the closing speed. Then the bombers opened fire. Werner had expected the tail gunner to engage. One man, two guns, tracking one target. He'd expected to see tracers, to take evasive action, to continue his run. What he didn't expect was what actually happened. The entire formation erupted. It wasn't fire from one bomber. It wasn't even fire from 3 or 4. Every B-17 inches, the forward element that could bring guns to bear opened up simultaneously. Tracer rounds arced through the sky, not in thin streams, but in a torrent, a waterfall of 50 caliber ammunition that seemed to fill every cubic meter of air between Werner's aircraft and the bomber formation. The tracers were bright in the thin, high-altitude air, visible even in daylight, every fifth round burning magnesium bright, which meant for every tracer he saw, 4 more invisible bullets streaked past. The volume of fire was incomprehensible. Werner had flown through anti-aircraft barrages over Soviet positions, had seen the sky turn black with flak bursts. This was different. This was precise, directed, a cone of interlocking fire that converged on his approach path. The tail gunner of his target bomber was firing, yes, but so were the ball turrets of the aircraft flanking it. So were the waist gunners of the bombers in the second element. So were the top turret gunners of aircraft in the third element, whose fields of fire could reach over their companions to engage him. Every position in that geometric formation, it could defend every other position. Werner's Messerschmitt shuddered as rounds struck home. He heard the impact, felt the aircraft jolt. Instinct took over. He broke left, diving, abandoning his attack run. Behind him, Klaus broke right, his aircraft also hit. The radio exploded with voices other pilots encountering the same overwhelming fire, shock and alarm, replacing professional calm. Werner's mind raced as he dove away from the formation. He'd been hit. How badly? The controls still responded. Engine temperature normal, oil pressure holding, minor damage then, lucky. But the attack had been a failure. He'd barely closed to 800 meters before breaking off. 800 meters far outside effective cannon range. He hadn't even fired. He pulled out of his dive at 6,000 meters, reforming with Klaus. His wingman's aircraft showed holes in the port wing, but was still flying. They climbed again, swinging wide around the bomber formation. Other Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds from their Gruppe were making their runs, and Werner watched with a sinking feeling as the pattern repeated. Each fighter would approach. The formation would erupt with fire. The fighter would break away. Some pilots pressed their attacks, and Werner saw one Messerschmitt stagger as multiple hits walked across its fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted and began to fall, trailing smoke. One of theirs, dead or dying, spiraling toward the German countryside below. The bomber formation flew on, unperturbed. Not a single B-17 had fallen out of formation. Several showed damage. Werner could see holes in wings, could see one bomber with an engine trailing smoke, but they maintained their positions. The geometric pattern held. Werner's radio crackled. Reform, all aircraft. We'll try frontal attacks. They can't have as much firepower facing forward. It was Major Hartmann, the Gruppenkommandeur, his voice strained but controlled. Frontal attacks, head-on passes against the stand, bombers. Higher closing speeds, less time in the defensive fire, but also less time to aim, and the target profile was smaller. Werner had trained for frontal attacks, but they required nerves of steel. You flew directly at a bomber, closing at combined speeds of over 800 kilometers per hour, fired at the last possible second, then broke over or under. Collision was a constant risk. So was misjudging the brake and flying through the bomber's propellers. But the Gruppenkommandeur was right. The rear approaches weren't working. The overlapping defensive fire was too intense. Perhaps from the front, where only the nose guns could engage, they'd have better success. Werner climbed again with Klaus, positioning for a head-on run. Other fighters from the Gruppe formed up, preparing for coordinated attacks. They needed to break up that formation, force the bombers to scatter. Individual bombers could be killed. This collective thing, this geometric defensive pattern, was proving almost invulnerable. Almost. Werner held on to that word. Almost invulnerable meant there was still a chance. He came around in a wide arc, positioning himself ahead of the bomber formation. The B-17 seconds droned on at their steady pace, apparently unconcerned. Their discipline was inhuman. Werner had fought Soviet pilots who would scatter at the first sign of German fighters. He'd fought British pilots who would break formation to chase a victory. These Americans simply flew on, maintaining their pattern, trusting their system. Werner steadied his breathing. The bomber formation approached from his 11 o'clock position, closing fast. He pushed the throttle to maximum power and turned into them. The lead B-17 grew in his windscreen, coming head-on. This was it. He could see the nose turret now, the twin 50 caliber barrels already tracking him. One turret, two guns. Those odds he could handle. The nose turret opened fire at 1,200 meters. Werner saw the tracer stream, adjusted his course slightly to throw off the gunner's aim. He was closing at over 800 kilometers per hour. The gunner couldn't track smoothly at that speed. Werner's finger tightened on the trigger, waiting for the range to close to 400 meters, where his cannons would be effective. Then the other bombers opened fire. Not just the lead aircraft's nose turret, but every top turret gunner in the forward element who could bring guns to bear on his approach. The mathematical reality hit Werner even as he pressed his attack. The bomber formation wasn't just deep, it was wide. Aircraft flew abreast of each other, their top turrets able to rotate and track targets approaching from the front. 6 top turrets swiveled toward him, 12 50 caliber machine guns, plus the nose turret. 14 guns firing at one fighter. The air ahead filled with tracers. Werner fired his cannons, saw rounds impact the lead bomber's nose section, saw glass shatter. Then he was pulling back on the stick, braking high, his aircraft shuddering as rounds struck his left wing. He cleared the bomber by meters, felt the turbulence from the formation's prop wash, fought to control his aircraft as it bounced and yawed. His left aileron was damaged. The control stick felt mushy, unresponsive. Werner tested the controls carefully, found he could still maneuver, but sluggishly. Another hit like that and he'd be done. He looked back at the formation. The lead bomber he'd hit was still flying, still in formation, though smoke trailed from its nose section. Not a kill, not even a formation break. 3 attacks now. 3 failures. And his aircraft was damaged. Klaus's voice came through the radio, tight with stress. "Hoffman, I'm hit bad. Oil pressure dropping. I have to head home." "Go," Werner said. "I'll cover you." But he couldn't cover Klaus. His aircraft was damaged too. They both turned for home, 2 damaged fighters retreating from a formation that simply flew on. Below them, Werner could see another fighter falling, spinning, trailing fire. One of the Fokker-Wulfs from their Gruppe. Then another aircraft he couldn't tell whose in a steep dive, smoke pouring from its engine. They were losing fighters, and the bombers hadn't lost a single aircraft. The radio chatter told the story. Pilot after pilot, reporting damage, breaking off attacks, heading for home. Some voices were panicked, others were professionally calm, but Werner could hear the underlying shock. The Gruppenkommandeur ordered a withdrawal to rearm and refuel. They'd try again when the bombers came back, after the bomb run. Maybe the Americans would be lower then, slower. Perhaps their formation would be looser after combat damage and the stress of the bombing run. Werner nursed his damaged Messerschmitt back toward the base, Klaus flying beside him, both aircraft trailing thin streams of coolant or oil. The October sky was clear and cold. Behind them, the bomber formation droned on toward Schweinfurt. Werner couldn't see them anymore, but he could imagine their steady progress, those massive four-engine bombers holding their geometric pattern, their gunners watching the sky for the next wave of fighters. He thought about the numbers again. 18 bombers in that lead box, 13 guns per bomber, 234 weapons, but that was just the first box. There had been 3 boxes in that formation, perhaps more beyond, 54 bombers total that he'd counted, possibly more. If the entire stream was that size, they were facing 700 machine guns. 700. No fighter pilot alive could fight through that kind of firepower. Not with skill, not with nerve, not with experience. It was simple mathematics. The Americans had built a system where individual heroism didn't matter, where even the best German ace was just another target in an equation of intersecting fields of fire. Werner's hands shook on the control stick. Not from fear, though. There was fear. There was always fear, but from the realization of what this meant. The Americans could bomb Germany in daylight. They could bomb German cities, German factories, German infrastructure, and the Luftwaffe couldn't stop them. Not with current tactics, not with current aircraft. The defensive firepower was too great, the formations too disciplined. He landed at the base 45 minutes later, his aircraft damaged but flyable. Klaus landed behind him, his Messerschmitt streaming smoke, the engine dying as he touched down. They climbed out of their aircraft in silence, looking at the damage. Werner's left wing was peppered with holes. 7 rounds had punched through the metal skin. Any one of them could have hit fuel, control cables, the engine. He'd been lucky. Klaus's aircraft was worse, coolant leaking, oil pressure gone, 1 aileron nearly shot off. Around them, other fighters were landing, some badly damaged. 2 didn't return. The ground crews rushed to service, the aircraft that could be repaired, already preparing for the next sortie. The Americans would come back, flying home after their bomb run, and the Luftwaffe would attack again. Werner walked to the operations room with Klaus and the other surviving pilots. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say yet. The magnitude of what they'd encountered needed to be processed. Inside, the operations officer was taking reports, tallying losses, counting ammunition expenditure. Werner gave his report mechanically. 3 attack runs, 1 frontal, 2 from rear quarter, moderate damage to own aircraft, no confirmed kills, multiple bomber strikes observed but no confirmed destruction. The Gruppenkommandeur entered, his face grim. Major Hartmann was 31 years old, veteran of Poland, France, Britain, Russia. He'd flown more than 200 combat missions. He looked tired now, older than his years. He listened to the reports from his pilots, asked pointed questions about the bomber formations, about the defensive fire patterns, about approach angles and tactics. Then he spoke. What we encountered today changes everything. These aren't the bomber formations we fought last year. The Americans have refined their tactics. They're flying combat boxes designed specifically to create overlapping fields of fire. Every approach angle we attempted was covered by multiple gun positions. The mathematics are against us. He paused, looking at the map on the wall showing the bomber's route to Schweinfurt. Intelligence estimated we could achieve a 10% loss rate on the American formation. Based on our observations and the reports from other Gruppen, we may have damaged 15 to 20 bombers. Out of more than 200 aircraft in the entire American formation, less than 10%, and we lost 8 fighters achieving that. The loss ratio is unsustainable. The room was silent. Werner understood what the major wasn't saying directly. If they lost 8 fighters, for every 20 bombers damaged, not destroyed, just damaged, the Luftwaffe would be bled white within months. The Americans could replace losses. They had the industrial capacity, the training pipeline, the resources. Germany didn't. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every fighter destroyed took weeks to replace, if it could be replaced at all. "We need new tactics," someone said. "Heavier armament, rockets, standoff weapons." "Yes," Major Hartmann agreed. "The technical branch is already working on solutions. But understand this, the American strategy is working. They're betting that their formations can survive long enough to destroy our industrial targets. And today suggests they may be right." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Werner left the briefing and walked to his quarters. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind was still racing. He'd been so confident that morning. 13 guns per bomber had seemed manageable. The flaw in his thinking had been the assumption that he'd be fighting one bomber. But the Americans didn't fly one bomber. They flew formations of 30, 50, 100 aircraft, all positioned to defend each other. The whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. He thought about the briefing officer that morning, pointing to the silhouette drawings. 13 guns. He'd shown where each gun was positioned, had discussed dead zones in the bomber's defensive coverage. But he hadn't shown how those guns overlapped when multiple bombers flew in formation. He hadn't explained that the combat box formation was designed so that every approach angle to every bomber was covered by guns from multiple aircraft. Or perhaps he had explained it, and Werner hadn't truly understood until he'd seen it himself. Until he'd flown into that wall of fire and realized that individual skill didn't matter when you were facing 234 machine guns. That evening, Werner wrote a letter to his brother, also a pilot, serving on the Eastern Front. He described the mission, the formation, the defensive fire. He tried to explain the mathematics of it, how the Americans had solved the bomber vulnerability problem not by making individual aircraft more survivable, but by making the formation collectively invulnerable. His brother would understand. He'd flown against Soviet armor formations, where individual tanks were vulnerable but massed formations could overwhelm through sheer firepower concentration. The Americans had applied the same principle to the air. Concentrated force multiplied defensive capability exponentially. Over the following weeks, Werner flew more missions against American bomber formations. The Luftwaffe adapted, developing new tactics. Frontal attacks became standard, trying to exploit the relatively weaker forward defenses. Some units equipped their fighters with underwing rockets, allowing standoff attacks from beyond machine gun range. Others used heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, carrying extra cannons, accepting reduced maneuverability for increased firepower. But the fundamental problem remained. The Americans kept coming, formation after formation, their combat boxes maintaining discipline even under attack. German fighter losses mounted. Experienced pilots died. Replacement pilots, fresh from training with minimal flight hours, died even faster. The mathematics that Werner had understood that October Day in 1943 played out in the skies over Germany month after month. By the winter of 1944, the situation had become critical. The Americans introduced long-range fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs that could accompany the bombers all the way to target and back. Now German fighters had to fight through American escorts just to reach the bomber formations, and even when they did, they faced the same overlapping fields of fire that made every attack potentially suicidal. Werner survived, many didn't. He flew his last mission against American bombers in March of 1944, 9 months after that first encounter with the combat box formation over Schweinfurt. By then, he'd learned to recognize the futility of certain attacks, to calculate odds with cold precision, to preserve his aircraft and himself for missions that had some chance of success. That pragmatism kept him alive even as younger, more aggressive pilots died around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd entered the war believing that skill and courage determined victory, that a good pilot in a good aircraft could defeat any odds. The Americans had proven that belief wrong. They'd created a system where individual excellence didn't matter, where the collective firepower of a formation could defeat even the most skilled attacker. They'd industrialized air defense the same way they'd industrialized everything else about their war effort. 13 guns per bomber. Werner would remember that number for the rest of his life. Not because it represented the armament of a single B-17, but because he'd failed to multiply it by 18, by 54, by 180. He'd thought like a fighter pilot, focused on individual combat, one aircraft against one target. The Americans thought like engineers, designing systems where every component supported every other component, where redundancy and mutual support created something far stronger than the sum of individual parts. The German military had always emphasized individual brilliance, the ace pilot, the brilliant tank commander, the aggressive infantry leader. Personal initiative and skill were celebrated. The Americans emphasized process, system, standardization. Their pilots weren't necessarily better individually, but their system was better. Their formations turned average pilots into a collective force that even the best German aces couldn't defeat. Werner understood this now. He understood it in the damaged aircraft he nursed home after each mission. He understood it in the faces of the pilots who didn't return. He understood it in the steady drone of bomber formations passing overhead, month after month, bombing German cities and factories, while the Luftwaffe threw itself against them and bled. The strategic implications were profound. Daylight bombing worked. The Americans could strike German industry, and even with heavy losses, they could sustain the campaign. Their industrial base could replace losses faster than they accumulated. Germany's couldn't. Every bomber shot down was replaced by 2 more. Every German fighter lost was 1 less defender. The mathematics were inexorable. By war's end, Werner had survived 68 combat missions. He'd achieved 11 confirmed victories, 4 of them heavy bombers. He was alive because he'd learned the lesson of that October day in 1943. He'd learned when to attack and when to preserve his aircraft, when the odds were merely dangerous versus when they were suicidal. Many pilots never learned that distinction. They died brave and accomplished nothing. After the war, Werner read the American strategic bombing surveys, the post-war analyses of the air campaign. The numbers were staggering. The 8th Air Force had lost thousands of bombers over Europe. Thousands. Entire bomb groups had been decimated on single missions. The loss rates were horrific by any measure, but the Americans had kept coming. They'd absorbed losses that would have broken any other air force and kept flying, kept bombing, kept grinding down German defenses through sheer material superiority. The combat box formation, that geometric pattern that had seemed so ominous that October Day, had been refined throughout the war. By 1944, the Americans were flying formations of hundreds of bombers, stacked in multiple boxes at different altitudes, protected by fighter escorts, creating an aerial armada that could only be described as overwhelming. The defensive mathematics Werner had first encountered over Schweinfurt had been multiplied until it became an irresistible force. He thought about the briefing officer who'd shown them the silhouette with 13 gun positions marked. That officer had been technically accurate. A B17G did carry 1350 caliber machine guns, but knowing that fact wasn't the same as understanding what it meant when multiplied across a formation of 180 bombers. The map wasn't the territory. The briefing wasn't the reality. Werner never became bitter about his wartime service. He'd fought for his country, had done his duty as he understood it, but he never romanticized it either. War wasn't about glory or heroism, he concluded. It was about systems and mathematics and industrial capacity. The Americans had understood this from the beginning. They'd built an air force designed around systems that could absorb losses and continue functioning. They'd created bomber formations where the loss of individual aircraft didn't matter because the formation itself survived. The lesson stayed with Werner for the rest of his life. Individual brilliance couldn't overcome systematic superiority. One skilled fighter pilot couldn't defeat 234 machine guns, no matter how brave or experienced he was. The Americans had proven that technology and tactics, properly integrated into a system, could neutralize individual expertise. They'd turned air combat from a contest of individual skill into an industrial process where the side with greater resources and better organization would inevitably prevail. 13 guns per bomber. It was the right answer to the wrong question. The question wasn't how many guns did one bomber have. The question was, how many guns could a formation bring to bear on a single attacker? Werner had learned the answer to that question the die-to-you Rees. Hard way, diving through a wall of tracer fire, that October day in 1943, 234 guns in the first box alone. More than 700 in the entire formation he'd encountered. No fighter pilot alive could survive those odds repeatedly. Some did survive, through luck and skill and caution. But survival wasn't the same as victory. The bombers kept coming, the factories kept burning, and the mathematics remained inexorable. The Americans had calculated correctly. Their defensive system worked, and that calculation, more than any single battle or tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the air war over Europe. Werner lived to be 78 years old, passing away in 1998. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to historians about his wartime experiences. He was always honest about what he'd seen and learned. When asked about the American bomber formations, he would describe that first encounter, the moment when his assumptions about individual combat collided with the reality of systematic defense. "I counted 13 guns per bomber," he would say, "but I forgot to multiply by 18. That was my mistake." The Americans didn't forget. They understood mathematics better than we did. That's why they won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning frost clung to the steel hull of the captured Sherman tank as it sat in the proving grounds at Kummersdorf, 25 kilometers south of Berlin. It was late autumn, 1944, and the war had turned decisively against Germany on every front. Inside the compound's testing facility, a group of German tank officers and engineers gathered around a peculiar trophy, an American M4A1 Sherman with the longer-barreled 76mm gun. This was not the familiar 75mm Sherman they had grown accustomed to destroying in France. This was something different, something that had begun appearing in greater numbers since July. One of the officers, a Hauptmann who had commanded Panthers in Normandy, ran his hand along the gun barrel's threaded muzzle brake. His unit had knocked out dozens of Shermans that summer, their superior KK-42 guns punching through American armor with almost casual efficiency. The Panther's frontal armor, 80mm of face-hardened steel, sloped at 55 degrees, equivalent to 139mm of vertical armor, had proven virtually immune to everything the Allies could throw at it. Or so they had believed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But reports from the front had begun to arrive that troubled the Wehrmacht's armored warfare experts. Shermans were penetrating Panthers from angles and distances that shouldn't have been possible. Not consistently, not often, but enough to raise questions. The wreckage of Panthers examined after battle sometimes showed penetrations through the mantlet, the curved armor shield protecting the gun that defied the known capabilities of standard American 76mm ammunition. Something had changed in the American arsenal, and Kummersdorf existed precisely to discover what that something was. The proving ground at Kummersdorf had been the heart of German weapons testing since 1875, when Prussia first established the artillery range in the Brandenburg forests. By 1944, it had evolved into a sprawling complex of firing ranges, metallurgical laboratories, and vehicle testing facilities. Captured Allied equipment from every theatre flowed through Kummersdorf's gates, British Matildas and Churchills from North Africa and Dunkirk, Soviet 34s and IS-2s from the Eastern Front, and American M3s and M4s from Tunisia and France. Each was subjected to exhaustive examination, armor thickness measured, welding inspected, mechanical components evaluated, and most critically, tested against German weapons to determine vulnerabilities. The Panther tank represented the pinnacle of German tank design philosophy in 1944, born from the shock of encountering the Soviet 34 at the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Panther had been rushed into production to counter the Red Army's superior armor. The result was a tank that combined the 34's sloped armor concept with German engineering precision and firepower. The Panther's 75mm KK-42 L70 gun, despite its modest caliber, generated more penetrating power than the feared 88mm gun on the Tiger, thanks to its extremely long barrel and high-velocity round. The standard Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing shell left the muzzle at 935 meters per second, faster than any Allied tank gun. More importantly, the Panther's frontal armor had proven itself in combat. The glacis plate, the upper front hull, was angled so severely that Allied tank shells simply ricocheted off into the sky. American tankers had learned this lesson painfully in Normandy. The standard M62 armor-piercing round fired from the Sherman's 76mm gun could not penetrate the Panther's glacis at any range. Even the American M10 tank destroyer, mounting a 3-inch gun with nearly identical performance to the 76mm, proved ineffective against Panther frontal armor. The only vulnerable points were the turret mantlet at very close range or flanking shots against the thinner side armor. German tankers in France had internalized these advantages. They knew that in a frontal engagement with American armor, they held every card. The Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters, while remaining invulnerable to return fire. This asymmetry shaped German tactics: present your frontal armor, engage at maximum range, and the superior gun would prevail. Panther crews spoke openly of the 4 Shermans for 1 Panther exchange rate, a grim mathematics that favored German armor in every calculation. But by September of 1944, something had shifted on the battlefield. At Aricourt in eastern France, American Third Army tank battalions, still primarily equipped with 75mm Shermans, had devastated newly formed German panzer brigades equipped with Panthers. The Germans lost over 60 tanks, while American losses remained minimal. The defeat was attributed to poor German crew training and superior American tactics, and that explanation satisfied most analysts. Yet some after-action reports contained troubling details: Panthers disabled or destroyed with frontal hits, penetrations through areas that should have been proof against American guns. The Waffenamt Prüfwesen, the German Army Weapons Office, needed answers. They needed to understand what new capabilities the Americans had developed and whether those capabilities posed a genuine threat to German armor superiority. This captured Sherman 76 at Kummersdorf represented an opportunity. Unlike the early M4A1s captured in Tunisia in 1943, like the Kummer's famous War Daddy II, that Albert Speer had personally inspected this, Sherman carried the improved gun and newer ammunition types. More importantly, American prisoners taken in France had mentioned a new type of anti-tank round, something they called HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. The Americans had developed tungsten-cored subcaliber penetrators, similar in concept to German Panzergranate 40 rounds. But while Germany had largely abandoned tungsten ammunition due to shortages of the rare metal, the Americans apparently had access to sufficient quantities for wide deployment. Or did they? Intelligence reports on HVAP availability varied wildly. Some suggested the rounds were plentiful, others indicated severe scarcity. The truth lay somewhere between, and determining that truth mattered enormously for German tactical planning. The German officers at Kummersdorf that autumn morning knew their mission. They would test this Sherman against a captured Panther hull. They would fire the available American ammunition through the 76mm gun. They would measure penetration, examine the quality of American armor-piercing shot, and assess whether this new threat required changes to Panther deployment doctrine or even design modifications. What they could not know, what they could not possibly anticipate, was how dramatically the technological landscape had already shifted beneath their feet. While Germany's industrial capacity strained under Allied bombing and resource shortages, American factories were producing not just more tanks, but better ammunition at a scale that defied German comprehension. The few HVAP rounds that had reached France represented only the first trickle of a flood that would transform American anti-tank capabilities. And the implications of that transformation would force a reckoning with an uncomfortable truth. Superior German armor design and crew skill might no longer be enough to offset American material abundance and technological innovation. The German armor doctrine of 1944 rested on several fundamental assumptions. First, that German tanks possessed qualitative superiority over their opponents. Second, that this superiority would compensate for Germany's declining numerical strength. Third, that Allied crews, while brave and determined, lacked the training and tactical sophistication of German tankers. And fourth, perhaps most critically, that the Allied nations could not match German engineering and metallurgical expertise in armor warfare. These assumptions had served Germany well through the early war years. The Panzer III and Panzer IV had swept through Poland and France with relative ease. Their combination of firepower, armor, and tactical mobility proving superior to most opposition. The appearance of the 34 in Russia had shattered some illusions. Here was a tank with better armor slope, a more powerful gun, and superior automotive performance than anything Germany fielded in 1941. The Soviet tank represented a design philosophy radically different from German practice, and it worked devastatingly well. The Panther was Germany's answer to that Soviet challenge. Engineers at MAN and Daimler-Benz had studied captured 34s intensively, measuring every dimension, testing every component, analyzing the choices Soviet designers had made. They borrowed the sloped armor concept wholesale. They improved upon it with superior steel quality and better welding techniques. They added the long-barreled 75mm gun that could penetrate 34 armor at ranges where the Soviet tank's gun remained ineffective. The result was a tank that, on paper and in initial combat trials, seemed to represent the perfect synthesis of Soviet innovation and German engineering precision. By the time Panthers reached the battlefield in numbers during the summer of 1943, they faced not only Soviet armor but also the first significant American tank presence in Europe. The Sherman tank that American forces deployed represented a fundamentally different design philosophy than either German or Soviet armor. American designers had prioritized reliability, ease of manufacture, and logistical sustainability over maximum armor protection or gun power. The Sherman's vertical armor and relatively modest 75mm gun reflected these priorities. It was a tank designed for mass production and global deployment, not for winning individual tank versus tank duels. German tankers quickly learned to exploit the Sherman's weaknesses. The vertical frontal armor, while adequate against German tanks of 1942, proved insufficient against the upgraded guns of 1943 and beyond. The narrow tracks and relatively high ground pressure compared to Panthers gave Shermans poor cross-country mobility in muddy conditions. Most critically, the Sherman's armor-piercing ammunition could not penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. American tankers developed tactics to compensate flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks with tank destroyers and artillery support, and when necessary, the brutal arithmetic of trading multiple Shermans to knock out a single Panther or Tiger. Yet American tankers also possessed advantages that German analysis often overlooked or dismissed. The Sherman's stabilized gun, a feature no German tank possessed, allowed American crews to fire accurately while moving, a significant tactical advantage in fluid combat situations. The Sherman's reliability meant American units maintained higher operational readiness rates than comparable German formations. Panthers might be superior in head-to-head combat, but Panthers that had broken down or run out of fuel couldn't fight at all, and American logistics ensured that destroyed Shermans were rapidly replaced, while German tank losses became increasingly irreplaceable as the war ground on. This was the context in which HVAP ammunition emerged as a potential game-changer. The development of tungsten-cored subcaliber penetrators promised to give American 76mm guns the penetration performance necessary to defeat heavy German armor frontally. If HVAP lived up to its theoretical potential, it would eliminate the Panther's primary advantage, frontal immunity. German tankers would no longer be able to rely on presenting frontal armor and engaging at maximum range. Every engagement would become a genuine duel, where tactical skill, crew training, and luck might matter as much as technical superiority. For the German officers at Kummersdorf, understanding HVAP's true capabilities became essential. Could these tungsten-cored rounds actually penetrate Panther frontal armor? At what ranges? Against which specific armor sections? How widely deployed were these rounds? And perhaps most importantly, did their existence require fundamental changes to German armor, tactics, or even emergency modifications to Panther design? The captured Sherman sat silent in the November cold, its gun pointed toward the firing range where a section of Panther hull armor had been positioned. Soon, German engineers would load American ammunition into that gun and conduct the tests that would answer these questions. The results would be documented, analyzed, and distributed to armor commands throughout the Wehrmacht. Those results would carry implications far beyond the technical specifications of ammunition and armor plate. They would force a confrontation with the reality that Germany's technological edge in armored warfare, the foundation upon which so much tactical and strategic planning rested, had eroded more quickly and more completely than anyone in Berlin cared to admit. But first, they had to understand exactly what they were facing. The testing would begin at dawn. The German testing methodology at Kummersdorf had been refined over decades of weapons development. Every captured tank that arrived at the facility underwent a standardized evaluation process. First, the vehicle itself was measured and documented dimensions, weight distribution, armor thickness at multiple points, welding quality, accessibility of components for maintenance. Mechanical systems were disassembled, inspected, and tested to assess reliability and engineering sophistication. Only after this comprehensive evaluation did the weapons testing begin. For anti-tank testing, Kummersdorf maintained a collection of armor plate sections from various captured tanks. These weren't complete vehicles, but carefully preserved hull sections and turret faces that allowed controlled testing of weapons effectiveness. The Germans had learned that testing against complete vehicles provided dramatic demonstrations for propaganda purposes, but yielded imprecise technical data. A penetration might succeed because the round struck a welding seam or a weak point in the casting. Controlled testing against uniform sections of armor plate provided reproducible, scientifically valid results that could guide tactical and design decisions. In November of 1944, Kummersdorf had access to multiple sections of Panther armor hull sections recovered from battlefield losses and factory production overruns. The testing protocol called for firing at ranges from 100 meters to 1,000 meters, measuring penetration depth, examining the condition of projectiles that failed to penetrate, and documenting any armor failures or unexpected behaviors. Each test would be photographed, with measurements recorded to the millimeter. The captured Sherman 76mm gun presented both opportunities and challenges for testing. Unlike German-made weapons, the Americans used different ammunition than German stocks. The captured tank had arrived with a limited supply of American rounds in its ammunition racks, mostly M62 armor-piercing capped rounds, some high-explosive shells, and intriguingly, a small number of rounds marked differently from standard ammunition. These bore the designation T4, and intelligence reports suggested these were the mysterious HVAP rounds that had begun appearing on French battlefields in late summer. 5 rounds. That's how many T4 HVAP rounds the Germans had available for testing at Kummersdorf that November. 5 precious rounds to understand a technology that might fundamentally alter the armor warfare equation on the Western Front. It was a desperately small sample size for drawing definitive conclusions, but it was all they had. Allied security around new ammunition types had proven effective. HVAP rounds were issued sparingly, priority going to tank destroyer battalions, and crews were instructed to account for every round fired. Capturing intact HVAP ammunition from the battlefield proved difficult. These 5 rounds represented a stroke of luck, or perhaps a dead American tank, the crew's final contribution to their enemy's intelligence gathering. The German test protocol began with baseline measurements using standard American M62 ammunition. This established the known performance envelope against which HVAP could be compared. The M62 was an armor-piercing capped round weighing approximately 15 pounds, fired at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second from the 76mm M1 gun. Previous testing and battlefield experience had established that this round could not penetrate Panther Glacis armor at any practical combat range. It could penetrate the thinner mantlet at very close range under 200 meters and could defeat side armor at most engagement distances, but frontal hull penetration remained beyond its capabilities. The testing crew at Kummersdorf loaded the first M62 round into the Sherman's 76mm gun. The procedure was methodical, professional. German ordnance experts had become skilled at operating captured equipment, a necessary expertise when your army regularly pressed enemy vehicles into service. The Sherman's gun controls were different from German designs, the sighting system unfamiliar, but the fundamental principles remained constant. The target, a section of Panther lower hull armor positioned at 100 meters range, weighted downrange. The first shot produced the expected result. At point-blank range, the M62 round struck the Panther armor with tremendous force, creating a bright flash and a resounding clang that echoed across the proving ground. When the smoke cleared and inspectors examined the impact point, they found a deep gouge in the armor surface, but no penetration. The steel had held. A second shot at 200 meters produced similar results. Heavy impact deformation, but no complete penetration. This matched German intelligence assessments perfectly. The standard American 76mm round simply lacked the penetrative power to defeat Panther frontal armor, even at close range. Then came the first HVAP round. The T4 round looked different from standard ammunition. Lighter weight, approximately 19 pounds, compared to the M62's 15 pounds, with a distinctive profile that marked it as a sub-caliber penetrator design. The tungsten carbide core, surrounded by an aluminum body, represented a different penetration philosophy than conventional armor-piercing shot. Rather than relying on mass and hardened steel, HVAP used extreme velocity and a dense, hard penetrator to punch through armor. The muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second, nearly 800 feet per second, faster than standard ammunition, translated to dramatically increased kinetic energy at the target. German engineers loaded the HVAP round carefully, aware that they had only 5 of these rounds available. The Sherman's gun was elevated slightly to account for the different trajectory of the higher velocity round. The target remained the Panther lower hull section at 100 meters. The order to fire was given. The HVAP round left the muzzle at over 3 times the speed of sound. The report was sharper than standard ammunition, the muzzle blast more violent. Downrange, the tungsten penetrator struck the Panther armor with focused, devastating force. When inspectors reached the target, they found something that shouldn't have been possible: clean penetration through 80 millimeters of face-hardened German armor plate. Not a deflection, not a partial penetration, but a complete hole punched through steel that was supposed to be immune to American tank guns. The German officers present exchanged glances. One data point proved nothing armor quality varied, and even the best plate sometimes contained flaws. They needed more tests. A second HVAP round was loaded and fired, this time at the Panther mantlet section positioned at 300 meters range. Again, penetration. The curved mantlet, which had proven resistant to standard American ammunition except at very close range, was defeated at what Germans considered medium combat range. With 3 HVAP rounds remaining, the test crew made a critical decision. They would test penetration capability against the Panther's glacis plate, the steeply sloped upper front hull that represented the tank's strongest armor. This was the armor that had made the Panther virtually immune to frontal attack. This was the armor that allowed German crews to present their strongest face to the enemy with confidence. If HVAP could penetrate the glacis, then the entire foundation of Panther tactical employment would require rethinking. The glacis plate section was positioned at 300 meters range. The HVAP round was loaded. The firing command was given. The tungsten penetrator struck the sloped armor at high velocity, and this time the physics of angled armor proved their worth. The round did not achieve clean penetration. The steep angle caused the penetrator to deflect, shearing off material as it slid across the face of the armor before losing energy and failing to punch through completely. The glacis had held barely. A second test at closer range produced a similar result. The HVAP could damage the glacis, could create dangerous spalling on the interior surface, but could not reliably achieve complete penetration through the most heavily protected section of the Panther's hull. With 1 HVAP round remaining, the test crew made their final measurement. They fired at the lower hull plate at 500 meters range, a typical combat engagement distance on the open terrain of northern France. The result: penetration. Not as clean as at 100 meters, and the armor plate was thinner on the lower hull than on the glacis, but penetration nonetheless. The HVAP round had defeated Panther armor at combat range. The test results were documented with German precision. Photographs, measurements, detailed observations of armor behavior and projectile performance. These results would be compiled into a report and distributed to relevant commands. But the raw data told only part of the story. The implications of what Kummersdorf had discovered required analysis, context, and strategic assessment. HVAP could defeat Panther frontal armor, but with significant limitations. The glacis plate remained resistant, particularly at combat ranges, but the mantlet and lower hull areas that standard American ammunition could barely scratch had become vulnerable. A Sherman equipped with HVAP could now threaten a Panther from the front at ranges up to 500 meters or more, depending on which part of the Panther's frontal aspect was struck. This wasn't a complete negation of German armor superiority, but it was a significant erosion of the advantage German tankers had relied upon. The larger question loomed: how much HVAP did the Americans actually have? The 5 rounds tested at Kummersdorf came from a single captured tank. Were these rounds widely available to Allied armor units? Or were they scarce, issued only to specialized tank destroyer battalions? The answer to this question would determine whether HVAP represented a manageable tactical challenge or a strategic disaster for German armor doctrine. German intelligence on American ammunition production and distribution remained fragmentary. Captured Allied supply documents suggested tungsten shortages were limiting HVAP production. Prisoner interrogations indicated that most American tankers had never seen or fired HVAP rounds. But other reports noted that tank destroyer units, particularly those equipped with M18 Hellcats mounting the same 76mm gun, seemed to have better access to the new ammunition. The picture was murky, and murky intelligence led to dangerous strategic miscalculations. What the Germans at Kummersdorf could not know, what their most pessimistic assessments failed to capture, was the scale of American industrial mobilization and the trajectory of HVAP deployment. The first 2,000 HVAP rounds had arrived in Europe by air in August of 1944. Priority allocation to tank destroyer battalions meant that Sherman tank crews initially received almost none. By November, when the Kummersdorf tests were conducted, the average 76mm equipped Sherman in France had received perhaps 1 or 2 HVAP rounds total. Supply remained desperately constrained by tungsten availability and production bottlenecks, but American industry was ramping up. By January of 1945, production would exceed 2,000 rounds per week. By March, over 18,000 HVAP rounds would be in Europe, though distribution remained uneven, and allocation priority still favored tank destroyers over tanks. More critically, the improved M93 version of HVAP with better penetrator design and even higher velocity would be standardized for production in early 45. The Americans were solving their ammunition problem through the same method they solved every problem: overwhelming industrial capacity applied systematically until the obstacle ceased to exist. German armor commanders receiving the Kummersdorf test results in December of 1944 faced a difficult assessment. HVAP was real, it was effective, but it seemed to be rare. Tactical guidance could be updated to emphasize the vulnerability of the Panther's mantlet and lower hull. Crews could be instructed to maintain longer engagement ranges where possible, to minimize exposure time, and to prioritize destroying American tank destroyers, which might be more likely to carry HVAP before engaging standard Sherman tanks. These were manageable tactical adjustments, not fundamental changes to armor doctrine. But this assessment contained a fatal flaw. It assumed that American capabilities in December of 1944 would remain relatively static. It failed to account for the accelerating pace of American technological and industrial adaptation, and it underestimated how rapidly battlefield conditions were shifting against Germany on every front. The window during which German armor could rely on technical superiority was closing faster than anyone in Berlin recognized. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The testing at Kummersdorf had provided answers, but those answers raised more troubling questions. HVAP represented a threat, but how immediate, how widespread, and what other technological surprises might American industry be preparing to deploy? The Germans had spent the first years of the war confident in their technical superiority. Now, in the waning months of 1944, that confidence was becoming a liability, a comfortable assumption that prevented clear-eyed assessment of how decisively the technological balance had shifted. The captured Sherman sat silent again after the testing concluded, its gun cool, its ammunition nearly expended. It would remain at Kummersdorf through the winter, available for additional testing if more captured ammunition became available. In a few months, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, some of Kummersdorf's museum tanks would be pressed into desperate last-stand defense. This Sherman might be among them, turned against its original owners in a final irony of a war that had produced nothing but ironies. But that future remained unknown in November of 1944. What the German officers knew was that American tank guns had become more dangerous, that their comfortable assumptions about frontal armor immunity required qualification, and that the war was becoming more unpredictable with each passing month. They documented their findings, filed their reports, and returned to their duties. The war would continue, armor would clash with armor, and tactical realities would be written in burning steel rather than measured test results. The story of HVAP and German awareness of it illuminates a larger truth about technological warfare. Superior equipment matters, but industrial capacity, logistical sustainability, and the ability to rapidly adapt and improve systems matter more over the course of a long conflict. Germany had entered the war with some of the world's best tanks and most skilled tankers. But by late 1944, those advantages were being systematically eroded by opponents who could afford to learn from mistakes, who could replace losses faster than they accumulated, and who could bring crushing material superiority to bear on every battlefield. The Germans had tested HVAP and understood its capabilities. What they failed to understand was the inexorable logic of attrition warfare against an opponent with greater resources, greater industrial capacity, and ultimately, greater staying power. The Panther remained a formidable tank through the end of the war. German crews continued to achieve impressive kill ratios when circumstances favoured them. But circumstances favoured them less and less as 1945 progressed, as American armour improved, as Allied air superiority made movement impossible during daylight, and as the strategic situation collapsed around them. The tests at Kummersdorf in November of 1944 provided data, but data alone could not alter the fundamental trajectory of the war. By the time German intelligence had fully assessed the threat of HVAP, American factories were already producing the next generation of improved ammunition. By the time German tactical guidance had been updated and distributed, the winter of 1944 brought Germany's final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes campaign that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler gambled everything on a surprise attack through the Belgian forests, hoping to split Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive would commit Germany's last significant armour reserves, including hundreds of Panthers and dozens of the even more formidable King Tiger tanks. It would also provide the first large-scale test of how HVAP ammunition performed in sustained combat conditions. American forces in the Ardennes were caught by surprise when the German offensive began on December 16, 1944. Entire units were surrounded, supply lines were cut, and for several days the situation seemed genuinely critical. But the Americans held key road junctions, artillery support remained effective despite the chaos, and critically, American armour responded to the crisis with speed and flexibility that German planning had not anticipated. Tank and tank destroyer battalions rushed to plug gaps in the line, often engaging German armour at point-blank range in village streets and forest clearings. This was exactly the kind of close-range, confused fighting where HVAP ammunition could make a decisive difference. Tank destroyer battalions, which had received priority allocation of the scarce tungsten rounds, found themselves in sudden, violent encounters with Panthers and King Tigers. At ranges of 300 meters or less, HVAP gave American crews a fighting chance. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, equipped with the same 76mm gun as upgunned Shermans, proved particularly effective. Fast, maneuverable, and now armed with ammunition that could threaten even heavy German armour from the front, Hellcat crews racked up impressive kill tallies throughout the Battle of the Bulge. But HVAP remained scarce. Even in December of '44, most American tank crews had never fired a single HVAP round in combat. Allocation remained tightly controlled, with priority going to tank destroyers rather than regular tank battalions. The average Sherman 76 in the Ardennes carried perhaps 2 or 3 HVAP rounds at most, while the rest of its ammunition load consisted of standard armour-piercing and high-explosive shells. Crews were instructed to save HVAP for critical engagements against heavy armour. This scarcity meant that while HVAP made a difference in specific engagements, it did not fundamentally transform the armour balance during the Battle of the Bulge. What defeated the German offensive was not wonder weapons or technological superiority, but the same factors that characterized the entire Western campaign: Allied air power, overwhelming artillery support, superior logistics, and the ability to rapidly reinforce threatened sectors with fresh troops and equipment. When weather cleared and Allied aircraft could fly again after Christmas, German armour columns became death traps. Panthers that had survived American tank guns were destroyed by rocket-firing fighter bombers. Supply lines were interdicted, fuel trucks were strafed, and German mobility evaporated under aerial attack. The Bulge offensive demonstrated that German armour, even when concentrated in large numbers with tactical surprise, could no longer achieve decisive results against Allied forces. The Wehrmacht's armour reserve was expended for minimal strategic gain. Hundreds of irreplaceable tanks were lost, along with thousands of experienced crew members. And perhaps most significantly, the offensive consumed fuel and ammunition that Germany could not replace, all for an operation that ultimately collapsed within weeks. For American tankers, the Battle of the Bulge crystallized the need for better anti-tank ammunition. The combat reports that flooded back to ordnance commands in the States were unambiguous. HVAP worked, crews wanted more of it, and production needed to accelerate immediately. The tungsten shortage that had constrained HVAP production was being addressed through both increased domestic mining and securing additional supplies from South America and China. By January of 1945, production rates were climbing steadily. By March, HVAP ammunition was becoming genuinely available rather than desperately scarce. But by March of 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine, Soviet forces were fighting in the suburbs of Berlin, and German resistance was collapsing on every front. The Panthers and Tigers that had once dominated European battlefields were increasingly abandoned beside roads, out of fuel or broken down, their highly trained crews dead or captured or scattered. The few German tanks still operational faced impossible odds, outnumbered, outgunned, and without air cover or adequate supply. The improved M93 HVAP round reached Europe in time for the final campaigns, standardized in February of 45, with better penetrator design and even higher velocity than the original T4 round. The M93 represented the full realization of American HVAP development. In testing, it could penetrate Panther mantlet at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. It could defeat King Tiger frontal armor at medium ranges. It was, finally, the ammunition that could allow American 76mm guns to fight German heavy armor on roughly equal terms. But there was almost no German heavy armor left to fight. The Panthers and Tigers that had seemed so invincible in Normandy were gone, destroyed in combat, abandoned for lack of fuel, or captured intact by advancing Allied forces. The few encounters between American armor and German tanks in the final weeks of the war were brief, desperate affairs where German crews fought without hope, simply trying to delay the inevitable. HVAP ammunition, when it was used, performed exactly as designed, but its strategic impact was minimal because the strategic situation had already been decided by factors far removed from ammunition performance. This pattern of technological solutions, arriving just as the problems they were meant to solve became irrelevant, characterized much of late-war weapons development. The Germans, too, had produced impressive new equipment in the final months. The King Tiger, with its long 88mm gun, could destroy any Allied tank at extreme range. The Jagd Panther tank destroyer combined Panther mobility with a fixed casemate, mounting a powerful 75mm gun. The Panther F, with improved armor design and the narrow Schmalturm turret, represented the ultimate refinement of German medium tank design. But these technological marvels meant nothing when Germany could barely produce them in meaningful numbers, could not supply them with fuel, could not provide replacement parts when they broke down, and could not protect them from Allied air attack. The real lesson of HVAP and German armor in 1944 and 45 was not about penetration tables or muzzle velocities. It was about industrial capacity and strategic sustainability. The United States could afford to deploy an inferior tank early in the war, learn its weaknesses through combat experience, develop solutions to those weaknesses, and scale production of improved ammunition while simultaneously designing next-generation vehicles like the M26 Pershing. Germany could produce magnificent individual tanks, but could not produce them in sufficient numbers, could not sustain them logistically, and could not adapt quickly enough when battlefield conditions changed. The testing at Kummersdorf in November of 44 revealed HVAP's technical capabilities, but German intelligence could not accurately assess American industrial capacity or the trajectory of American weapons development. The 5 HVAP rounds tested represented not a static capability, but a snapshot of an evolving system. By the time German tactical guidance had been updated, American production had already moved beyond the ammunition being assessed. This was the fundamental asymmetry that doomed Germany, not that American weapons were better on any given day, but that American weapons improved faster and in greater quantity than Germany could respond. There's a certain tragic irony in the Kummersdorf tests. German engineers and officers performed their duties professionally and competently. They documented HVAP's capabilities accurately. They provided sound tactical recommendations based on the data. But their analysis operated within a framework that assumed the war could still be won, or at least stabilized, through superior German technology and tactical skill. This assumption was already false by November of 1944. The war would be decided not by whether Panthers could resist HVAP at 500 meters, but by whether Germany could sustain military operations at all against enemies attacking from multiple directions with overwhelming force. The captured Sherman at Kummersdorf represented more than just a test vehicle. It embodied everything German military planners had underestimated about American capabilities. Not exceptional in any individual characteristic, the Sherman was slower than a Panther, more poorly armored, less powerfully armed, but exceptionally reliable, exceptionally easy to maintain, exceptionally well supported by logistics, and backed by an industrial system that could produce 50,000 of them, while Germany struggled to produce 6,000 Panthers. Quality mattered in individual engagements. Quantity mattered in the long war of attrition that the conflict had become. American tankers who survived the war often spoke about HVAP with something approaching reverence. To crews who had spent months in Normandy knowing their guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armor, the arrival of HVAP ammunition felt like a gift from the gods. Finally, they had rounds that gave them a fighting chance. Finally, they didn't have to rely entirely on flanking maneuvers and numerical superiority. The psychological impact of HVAP extended beyond its actual ballistic performance. It restored confidence. It changed the calculus of engagements. It allowed American crews to think about fighting Panthers head-on rather than simply surviving encounters with them. But the veterans also understood that HVAP alone didn't win the war. Superior tactics, excellent crew training, overwhelming artillery support, complete air superiority, and the simple ability to replace losses faster than they accumulated, these factors mattered more than ammunition performance. HVAP was a tool, one tool among many, and its effectiveness depended on using it within a larger system of combined arms warfare that the Allies had mastered, and the Germans, by late war, could no longer sustain. The German tankers who faced HVAP in combat, the survivors who lived to discuss their experiences, remembered it differently. To them, HVAP represented one more erosion of the advantages they had relied upon. First, the Allies had achieved air superiority, making daylight movement suicidal. Then artillery became increasingly deadly as American forward observers and fire direction centers achieved near-perfect accuracy. Allied infantry gained better anti-tank weapons, bazookas that could threaten even heavy tanks from the flank. And now, tank guns that had been relatively harmless against frontal armor suddenly became dangerous at combat ranges. The cumulative effect was demoralizing. The technological superiority that German propaganda had promised, that German crews had experienced in early war victories, was slipping away piece by piece. Some German accounts from late in the war speak to this psychological shift. Panther commanders who had once engaged enemy armor with confidence now approached every engagement with gnawing uncertainty. Would this Sherman have HVAP? Would that tank destroyer be able to penetrate from this angle? The comfortable certainty of frontal immunity was gone, replaced by a corrosive doubt that affected decision-making and tactical aggressiveness. This psychological dimension, the erosion of confidence and the increase in operational stress, may have mattered as much as the actual ballistic threat HVAP posed. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, HVAP ammunition had become readily available to American forces. The Korean War, which began 5 years later, saw American M4, a 3E H Shermans, equipped with plentiful supplies of improved HVAP ammunition. Against North Korean 34-85s, the Sherman with HVAP proved entirely adequate, capable of penetrating the Soviet tank's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. The ammunition shortage that had constrained HVAP effectiveness in World War II no longer existed. American industry had solved the problem, as it solved most problems through systematic application of resources until the obstacle ceased to exist. The captured Panthers and Tigers that fell into Allied hands at war's end were subjected to exhaustive testing, just as the Germans had tested captured Allied equipment at Kummersdorf. American ordnance experts wanted to understand why German tanks had been so effective, what design features gave them advantages, and how future American tank development could incorporate the best aspects of German engineering. These tests confirmed what combat experience had already demonstrated. German tanks were exceptionally well designed for tank versus tank combat, but suffered from mechanical complexity, high production costs, and logistical fragility. The American approach, emphasizing reliability, ease of manufacture, and logistical sustainability over maximum combat performance, proved more strategically sound for sustained modern warfare. The German approach produced magnificent individual machines that required highly trained crews and extensive maintenance infrastructure. Both philosophies had merit, but in a total war fought across multiple continents against enemies with greater industrial capacity, the American approach allowed for the kind of sustained, grinding attrition warfare that ultimately broke Germany's military power. The Kummersdorf testing facility was captured by Soviet forces in April of 1945 as the Red Army closed in on Berlin. The Russians found a treasure trove of captured Allied equipment and German prototypes, including the massive Maus super heavy tank that had been tested there. The Sherman that German engineers had used to test HVAP may have been among the vehicles pressed into service for the final defense of the facility, or it may have been destroyed by retreating German forces to prevent its recapture. Records from those final chaotic weeks are incomplete. What is known is that Kummersdorf's role as Germany's premier weapons testing facility ended with Soviet occupation, and the complex would remain under Russian control for the next 50 years. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years later, the story of HVAP and German armor testing illuminates the complexity of technological warfare. Individual innovations matter. The tungsten cord penetrator that gave American guns the ability to threaten Panther frontal armor represented genuine technological achievement. But individual innovations succeed or fail within larger strategic and industrial contexts. HVAP mattered because American industry could produce it in quantity once the decision was made to prioritize tungsten allocation. HVAP mattered because American logistics could distribute it to combat units in Europe. HVAP mattered because American training could ensure that crews understood when and how to use it effectively. The Germans at Kummersdorf understood the technical threat HVAP posed. What they could not fully grasp was how completely the strategic balance had shifted against Germany. Superior German tanks, superior German crew training, superior German tactical doctrine. None of these advantages could compensate for fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly greater resources and industrial capacity. The tests at Kummersdorf provided accurate technical data, but that data was interpreted within a strategic framework that assumed Germany could still win, or at least force a negotiated settlement, through military excellence. By November of 1944, that assumption bore no relationship to reality. The captured Sherman sat in the Kummersdorf testing range that cold November morning, a piece of American steel on German soil, about to reveal secrets its designers had worked hard to protect. The German engineers loaded the unfamiliar ammunition, conducted their tests with characteristic precision, and documented results that confirmed their fears. American tank guns had become dangerous. Panther frontal armor could be defeated by tungsten-cored projectiles at combat ranges. The comfortable assumptions that had governed German armor tactics for the previous year required revision. But revision of tactics could not reverse the strategic tide. Germany was running out of fuel, out of steel, out of trained crews, out of time. The Panther remained a formidable tank through the end of the war, but formidable tanks could not compensate for strategic collapse. HVAP represented one more data point in a larger pattern, the systematic erosion of every advantage Germany had possessed at the war's start. Air superiority lost, naval superiority never achieved, industrial capacity overwhelmed, technological edge neutralized, and finally, even armor superiority. The foundation of German land warfare doctrine reduced to marginal advantage rather than decisive superiority. The morning of that test firing at Kummersdorf, the German officers might have hoped their findings would allow tactical adjustments that could restore some measure of equilibrium. Perhaps Panthers would be deployed more carefully. Perhaps engagement ranges would be increased. Perhaps allocation of German armor would be reconsidered to account for the new threat. These hopes reflected professional competence and tactical sophistication, but they also reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic reality Germany faced. The war would not be decided by whether Panthers could resist HVAP at 500 meters. It would be decided by fuel supplies, by industrial output, by manpower reserves, by the ability to sustain operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. On all of these measures, Germany had already lost. The story of HVAP and German awareness of American ammunition development demonstrates how technological competition plays out in modern warfare. Innovation drives counter-innovation. Better armor requires better ammunition. Better ammunition drives improved armor design. This cycle continues as long as industrial capacity and scientific expertise allow. But that cycle operates within strategic constraints. The best ammunition matters little if you lack the industrial capacity to produce it in quantity. The most advanced armor design matters little if you cannot manufacture enough tanks to replace combat losses. Technology matters, but sustainable systems matter more. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.